Well, Brother Comfort, thank you for this second interview. We enjoyed the first one and looking forward to this second one in which we discuss the time after your salvation through your time in college. And so I'd like to just give a brief rehearsal about your salvation testimony, just briefly as we enter in. But it was in November of 1953.
Right.
And tell us again the circumstances about that.
Well, I think a turning point in my life and our family was when my brother Billy was saved. He was in the military and on his way downtown in Panama City, Florida to get drunk with a buddy. And in the providence of God, there was an open air meeting where a preacher preached a simple salvation message. And he talked about how a person could know he's on his way to heaven, know his sins are forgiven. And so when he finished his message, he said, "Now I'm going to close in prayer. If you'd like to talk to me further, come down." So Billy told his buddy, he said, "I'm going to go down and talk to that preacher." Well, the long story short, Billy was saved that day. Instead of going downtown and getting drunk, he went back to his barracks, wrote his little brother a letter, his mom and dad a letter, and said, "I've been saved. And God has changed my life, and I want you to have what I've experienced." So Billy came home on furlough shortly after that. By the way, it's interesting that Billy went to Hugh Pile's church after he got saved. Billy was signed up for 4 years in the Air Force, and they prayed. Billy felt pretty much immediately the call to preach, and so he wanted to go to a Christian college and train to be a preacher. And there was a large Bob Jones influence in Hugh Pile's church. And so they began to pray that Billy would get out of the military early so he could train for the ministry. So after 2 years, instead of being in 4 years, he got a discharge and went to Bob Jones on the GI Bill. And I was living in Asheville at that time. And Billy said, "Why don't you come down to Bob Jones and see me?" So I had just been saved in 1953, as you had mentioned. And so I went down. I played hooky from junior high, the 9th grade, and hitchhiked down to Bob Jones, spent the day. And Billy said, "You know, Ronnie, it'd be wonderful if you could be here in the academy." And he said, "Pray about it." I said, "Well, I'll pray about it." But I thought it was an impossibility. I think I only prayed once or twice about it. Well, after I went back to Asheville shortly, my stepmother and dad moved back to Elmira. And so Billy had gotten out of the military, went to Bob Jones for 1 semester. After the semester was over, he came to Elmira and got me involved in passing out tracts on the street and having street meetings. Billy would do the preaching and I would do the singing on the street corners. And we'd go around with a wordless book, and we had several young people make professions of faith. And so we were in a street meeting in Elmira. Billy was preaching, and a policeman came and stopped us. And he said to my brother, "Young man, you can't do this without a permit." So after he stopped us, Al Shaw, who was superintendent of the rescue mission, came over to us. He saw that the police had stopped Billy's preaching, And he said, boys, he said, I've listened to you preach, and he said, I like your preaching. He said, I want you to transfer your preaching over across the street to the rescue mission. He said, I was saved out of a drunkard's life, and the same message that you've been preaching on the street corner is what God used to save me. And he said, I want you to do 3 weeks of meetings. He said, Ronnie, you do the singing, and Billy, you do the preaching. So I went back to my dad. Now, I had sung on the radio and television and the stage and across North Carolina, and now I had a radio program in New York State at Elmira. As a matter of fact, we had a Western band, and they have what's called, it's a charitable thing, and they have it every year. And we were the first Western band to ever get an invitation to be on this charitable situation. I had a radio program. In the band, there was a steel guitar, Hawaiian guitar player, a lead guitar player, and I played the rhythm guitar and did the singing mostly. And so I had gone back to Dad, and I said, Dad, God saved me. He's called me to preach. And I said, if you'll let me, I'll go to Bob Jones Academy and begin to be prepared to be a preacher. And he said, son, he said, you're a fool. He said, everything we've worked for, all of your life is down the drain if you do that. I said, Dad, that's in the past. I don't have any desire to do that, but I do have a desire to preach. And I said, if you'll let me, I'll go to Bob Jones Academy as a sophomore and begin my preparation. He said, well, you can go, but if you go, I will not send you 1 penny. So in the 3 years I was in the academy, Dad did not send me 1 penny. In the 4 years I was in college, one weekend Dad broke his word and sent me $5. So in 7 years at Bob Jones, he sent me a total of $5. But right away, God began to multiply unto me moms and dads. Jesus said in Mark 10 and verse 30, no man's left father, mother, house, and lands, wives and children, but I'll multiply unto them 100-fold. And God began to do that to me. As we were finishing the 3 weeks of meetings, Al Shaw called me to the platform the last night, and he said, Ronnie, he said the offerings for the 3 weeks had been $150. And he said, here's a check made out to you, and we want you to enroll in Bob Jones Academy and begin to preach. He said, you're my Timothy. You're my son in the faith. And as we went down to Bob Jones that fall, there were 4 of us from Elmira. In those days, Hillcrest Baptist Church in Elmira, New York, was a good fundamental Baptist church. Before Billy came home, I had tried several churches, but I'd never felt at home in any of those churches. Well, Billy directed me to Hillcrest Baptist Church. And here was Clyde Truax, a graduate of the Johnson City Bible College, Johnson City, New York. And there was a large young people's group. Many of them were going off to Bible colleges and trained for the ministry. So it got me really excited about going to Bob Jones and begin my preparation. I remember sitting in chapel and seeing an older man. Now, it's kind of funny for me to say an older man because I'm a lot older now than what Dr. Bob Jones Sr. was in those days. But he would traipse across the platform. He would put his Bible over the limit of the number of minutes that you could preach. So he didn't even pay attention to that. But, God put a stirring in my heart. And as a 16-year-old boy, my attitude was, I don't care about brick houses. I don't care about designer clothing or automobiles. Live or die, I'm going to preach the gospel. And as a 16-year-old boy, God put a fire in my heart that has never gone out. And so Billy, as he had come from a military background, he had a real burden for military men. And so he started going to Columbia. He headed up a military missions group. And I have seen my brother win 20 people to Christ over a weekend. Dr. Stenholm, who was head of the preacher boys at Bob Jones, told me, he said, Billy Comfort was the greatest soul winner that we've ever had at Bob Jones. And so Billy got his brother out of the ping pong room and out of the ball field and going to Columbia on the weekend. And as a sophomore, junior, and senior, I was exposed to some real soul winning on the streets of Columbia, South Carolina. Well, Billy worked in the summertime. Now, he was on the GI Bill, but he was working not for himself, but to help his little brother pay his room, board, and tuition. So, and Billy, it wasn't really wise for us to be roommates because he thought he was my father, and he wanted to keep me under his wing and make sure that I was focused on the right thing. And so Billy would get me out on the weekends winning souls. After my junior year in high school, Billy graduated. So I was on my own from then. Billy immediately went to Norfolk, Virginia, and was involved in the military missions. As I said, he was very intellectual. And he could wrap an agnostic around his little finger. And he loved to get agnostics and intellectuals in a debate. And he won so many of those to Christ. And so eventually, Billy began to pastor in Chesapeake, Virginia, in an independent Baptist church. When I graduated from, and by the way, God was training me at that time for what I would do in the future in starting Ambassador Baptist College. As a junior in high school, I was president of my society. And as a senior, I was vice president of my society, but I was president of student body. When I went into college, I was on the waxing crew. I was head of the waxing crew. And it's interesting that God led Larry Brubaker to school as a freshman. He was a year behind me. And after a while, Larry was working on the waxing crew with me. And so we started talking about formulating a group. And Larry and I and another college student formed a trio. And every weekend, when I graduated from high school and went into college, I would go out on the weekends with this team. We even held revival meetings with the team. it was interesting that when I graduated, the contacts that I made on those 4 years of weekends out on extension, they opened up 10 weeks of meetings for us. And Tom Koss, who later became head of the biology department at Bob Jones University, traveled with us. And we had wonderful weekends. We would get back at 1 and 2 o'clock on Sunday morning many times, and have to wake up at 6:30 and go to breakfast and then to our classes. But it was wonderful seeing God work, and God just impressed on my heart that that's what I ought to do in my lifetime ministry, to be an evangelist. Somebody asked me when they think that I was called to preach, and I said I believe that God, the night I was saved in that citywide meeting after Billy had laid the groundwork, I believe God called me to preach that night, because the next day as I walked down the streets of Asheville, I never realized, this was November, I never realized that the leaves were so beautiful falling from the trees, and the sunset and the sunrise was so beautiful. And I could picture myself preaching to crowds of people, even at that time, just out of the 9th grade. And so that was my whole focus when I went to Bob Jones, and God had my brother keep me straight to keep my focus straight. But God, as I said, multiplied unto my moms and dads. My freshman or my sophomore year in high school, Billy Shelton was a roommate. Billy's parents lived in Greenville. Billy lived in the dorm. And one day Billy came to me and he said, Ron, I've told my parents about you and they want to meet you. And could you go home with us this week for supper? And so I did. And right away God established a wonderful relationship with the Sheltons and me. They said, Ron, as long as you're at Bob Jones Academy and University, every weekend you'll go to the mailbox and you'll find an envelope in the mailbox with some money for your incidentals. And many times they sent me a check to put on my room board and tuition. So that relationship kept on through my whole college career. When I graduated from high school, Ed Shaw came to me from Caldwell, Idaho, and he said, Ron, he said, if you could go home with me this summer, you could stay in our house and we can get you a job on construction. So I went home with Ed Shaw that summer and worked as a hod carrier for a bricklayer. After 5 weeks, the house that we were building was finished. And so I looked around Caldwell for work and couldn't find any. And somebody came to me and said, now, Ron, if you can get to Chicago, you can get a good paying job, make some money to go back to school in the fall. So I hitchhiked from Caldwell, Idaho to Chicago, Illinois. I didn't know anybody in Chicago, but I stayed in the YMCA hotel for 2 weeks looking for a job, and I came within a half an inch of finding a job. You say, what do you mean? Well, I went to the railroad and they measured me and they said, you're 5 feet 5 and a half. And we have a policy that we do not hire anybody unless they're 5 feet 6 at least. I think I'm going to sue them, but anyway, I didn't know what I was going to do. And the last day I was in Chicago, I got a call from a roommate, from a classmate, Barbara Bentley. And she said, Ron, I understand that you're looking for a job. Now, number one, I don't know how she called the YMCA hotel to get me. I don't know how she knew I needed a job. But she said, if you can get here to Buffalo, New York, you can stay with us in our house. My dad said you can be his helper. He's an electrician and you can earn some money to go back to school in the fall. So again, I hitchhiked from Chicago to Buffalo, New York, stayed with the Bentleys the rest of the summer. And they were so kind to me. It wasn't long until Mr. Bentley realized that I didn't have any electrical capacity. So he had me painting their house. So I earned some money to go back to school by painting their house. But before I left, they said, Ron, we have one daughter and we feel like we have a son. We feel like you're our son. We want you to call us Mom and Dad Bentley. And if you have a need, don't hesitate to call on us when you go back to school. So I went back to school and I had a basketball injury. I was lying on the hospital bed with a cartilage operation, and I got that dreaded letter from the business office. And they said, Ron, we have kept you long enough without your being able to pay your bill. We have no recourse. If your bill is not paid by such and such a date, we have to send you home. I didn't know where that money was coming from, Brother Bill. But before that day was over, I got a letter from Mom and Dad Bentley. And they said, Ron, we love you like a son. And God has laid on our heart to send you this check. Do you know how much that check was for? It was for the exact amount of the penny that I owed in the business office. Again, God multiplied unto me a mother and a father. After my freshman year in college, Fred Skeels came to me. He was in my society. And he said, Ron, I've told my parents about you in Roseburg, Oregon. He said, my dad works in the lumber business. He owns a lumber company. He said, if you can come to Roseburg this summer, you can stay in our house and you can get a job in the sawmill. So I went out home with Fred that summer. And for 3 summers, I was at the Skeels house, staying in their home. And before I left my senior year, and by the way, this is interesting, the Skeels came to my graduation. My parents never came to my graduation from high school nor my college graduation. My parents never came to my wedding. They never met my wife-to-be until we were married, and then we went up to Niagara Falls on our honeymoon. But anyway, the Skeels said, we have 2 daughters, Kathy and Karen. We have 1 son, Freddie, and now we feel like we've got a little son. We feel like you're our son. And if you have a need, don't hesitate to call on the Skeels. The Skeels sent us money at Christmas time when my girls were growing up to go from Clarksburg, West Virginia to Roseburg, Oregon to be with them at Christmas. Every Christmas for many years until the Skeels went to heaven, they would send a check at Christmas and they'd say, divide this 5 ways for our grandchildren, our 3 daughters, and our children, my wife and me. The Skeels flew from Roseburg to Phoenix, Roseburg to Tampa to be with us in meetings. And I believe that if I needed $10,000, I could call them tomorrow if they were living and say, Dad Skeels, I need to borrow $10,000. I believe it'd be in the mail. But God, all through high school and college, sent people in my way to help me to get to the place where I am right now. When I graduated from college, it's interesting. God laid on my heart during my senior year that I was going to take a group on the road. And so God, in His wisdom, put Larry Brubaker in the next room to my dormitory where I was living. The first day of school, my senior year, I came to Larry. Larry had gotten in at 2 o'clock in the morning, and it was 7 o'clock in the morning now. So I went in the next room and I woke him up. And I said, Larry, we're going to travel this summer. And we're going to be in evangelistic meetings. And Larry was too sleepy to say no. He said, okay. And he went back to sleep. But that year we were out every weekend in meetings, youth meetings, revival meetings, Sundays in churches. As a sophomore, and this was very unwise, but God led us to have a relationship with a pastor by the name of Brother Kellum. He was pastoring in Reidsville, North Carolina. I had a roommate, Frank Carroll, that was out of that church, and he got me introduced to his pastor. And here I was, a sophomore in college, and he asked me to come and hold a revival meeting. And so God established a wonderful relationship. He went then to McLeansville, a suburb of Greensboro, and he pastored there, and he said, Ron, we want to ordain you. So as I think it was my junior year, I was ordained.
Wow.
So I became a reverend
Yeah.
as a junior, but that was unwise, really. I was a novice, not ready to be ordained. But I think God did all this to prepare me for what He had in the future. So that summer, Larry, Tom Koss, and I traveled. Now this is interesting. We were in West Virginia in a meeting in Fairmont, and Howard Barnes, who was pastoring at West Milford, brought some young people to our meeting in Fairmont. And he said, Ron, can you come in November and hold a 2-week meeting with the team? And one of those young ladies was a high school girl by the name of Joyce Kennedy. And I guess I must have shaken hands with her that night, but neither one of us thought anything would come of that. But in September, Tom Koss went back to get married, went back home and then to school. But Larry and I traveled together until November. The last meeting we held together was in West Milford. Now, very few times in my ministry have I seen an entire community affected by a meeting. But in that meeting in West Milford, West Virginia, we had 40 young people make professions of faith. Many of them were baptized. There were people coming from the Methodist Church that were coming and getting saved in that meeting. I got a call from the Methodist preacher, and he said, Mr. Comfort, he said, you're disturbing my people. Now, I had heard Dr. Bob Sr. say that someday you will meet a preacher that denies the Bible be the Word of God. And I thought, now it's going to be a long time before I'm in the ministry when I meet somebody like that. But this Methodist preacher said, Mr. Comfort, you believe in the written word. He said, I don't. I believe in the living Word. Now, I was still wet behind the ears, but I knew enough to ask him this question. I said, Preacher, where do you read about the living Word? I said, you read about the living Word in the written Word. All you know about Jesus is in the Bible. And I said, if you reject the Bible, you reject the living Word too. You cannot separate the two. But when so many young people were saved, Howard Barnes, who was the pastor of that church, had been director of Youth for Christ. And so for about 3 or 4 months, as Howard Barnes came to that church in West Milford, they had been without a director. And so some of the board of directors came to the meeting, and they approached me at the end of the meeting with Howard Barnes' encouragement and said, why don't you ask Brother Comfort if he would pray about being Youth for Christ director? And so they came to me, and I said, well, let me pray about it. I said, now you need to know that God's called me to be an evangelist, and that's my lifetime ministry. I said, I'm not, as a Youth for Christ director, as a lifetime ministry. I said, now, if I do accept the position, I will tell you that I'll probably be here for 2 years, but I also will come on the stipulation that I can hold 2 weeks of meetings every month. And so finally, after they prayed about it and I prayed about it, they asked me to be director of Youth for Christ. I had 14 Bible clubs in public schools. And one of those public schools was West Milford. Let me say that Joyce Kennedy, who became my wife-to-be, she said that they were talking about the meeting in the school, in the classroom, in the lunchroom, in study hall. It affected the entire community. And so in that West Milford Bible Club was Joyce. She, by the way, was saved in that meeting that I held in her church. She had gone forward as a 7-year-old girl. And the pastor of the church at that time said, now Joyce Kennedy has come to join the church. No, she had come to be baptized. She didn't come to join the church. And the pastor said, we all know Mrs. Kennedy. She's a wonderful Christian. And so I want a motion that we accept upon Joyce's baptism into the church.
So when she came, was she coming for salvation? And then they just took her into the church and didn't deal with her then? Is that?
Yes.
Wow, that's really amazing.
And you know, it was a long time because of that. Even after we were married, that Joyce was troubled about her salvation because, you see, she said for the first time during the meeting, I would give the invitation. If you can give a Bible reason why you know you're saved, if you died right now, you can give me a Bible reason why you know you could go to heaven. She couldn't give a Bible reason. So one night she went home and she got down on her knees and she said, God, I'm not saved. She said, I came, but nobody showed me how to be saved. And I got baptized in the river, but I'm not saved and I want to be saved now. So she was a pianist in the church, but unsaved. And so, a long story short, in the 2 years that we were in Youth for Christ, there was not 1 week that we didn't have some profession of faith. We had rallies every 2 weeks in Linden School Auditorium. It was a junior high that was in Clarksburg. And we would have normally 200 to 300 every rally. And I would visit these 14 Bible clubs. And Joyce was in the West Milford Bible clubs. Joyce is a lot smarter than her husband. In the West, they won the Bible quiz championship. And they had memorized the books of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And I would ask a question, and before I would get halfway through the question, I think there were 4 girls and 1 boy in that Bible quiz team. And so they won. And I was very, very apprehensive because at that time I was getting an interest in Joyce, and I didn't want it to look like there was a conflict of interest. So I was harder on Joyce than I was on the other kids in the Bible club. But anyway, her winning team got to go to the Bill Rice Ranch in the summer. And she got introduced to my type of evangelism at the Bill Rice Ranch, and God was preparing her. As a matter of fact, when I would go to her Bible club on Tuesday, her mother said, Brother Comfort, I'll wash your clothes and you can eat supper with us. And I think that Mrs. Kennedy was kind of laying the groundwork for something more. However, her dad didn't want it. Her dad said, now listen, Joyce, an evangelist has a girlfriend in every church he goes into. So you don't want to marry an evangelist. But anyway, God worked it out to one day. I came to Mr. Kennedy and I said, Mr. Kennedy, God has given your daughter and me a relationship, and I would like to marry your daughter. He never did say that he would give his consent. As a matter of fact, when Joyce went to get the license, her dad was with her, and he said, now, Joyce, I didn't say that I consented to this wedding. And she said, Dad, it's too late. It's going to happen in a couple of weeks. So anyway, after 2 years, and again, as I was in meetings 2 weeks out of every month, God established wonderful relationships with pastors across the country. And when I got ready to go into evangelism, and Joyce, after we got married, by the way, she only had been out of high school for 1 summer when we got married. Now, I don't tell people how old she was, but I will say that I'm 8 years older than she. But, you know, the Bible says train up a child in the way it should go. And so it's really worked. But anyway, she has been a tremendous asset. And I believe that her mother trained her unknowingly to be an evangelist's wife.
Well, and I think about the experience she had when she was 7 years old, not being dealt with properly, and then getting saved a little bit later on. And I think about through the many years in evangelism that you guys have traveled together, and her children's meetings. You know, what she experienced as a child, I'm sure when she, ministered to so many children in those meetings, she wanted to make sure that they were dealt with, or that they were, to me, she probably had a real sensitivity in her heart. You know, when these children would come, Miss Joyce, I want to be saved. You didn't have to worry about what she was going to tell them, because she wanted to make sure that they were handled properly. And so she really has ministered through the years to so many young people. But I think back to that experience when she was 7, and how important it is of how we deal with children when it comes to spiritual things.
Yes, and as a young lady just getting married, she had no idea what the future would hold. We pioneered several things that the independent evangelists now use. For instance, right away after we got married, we were staying in houses, and I realized that this wasn't good for a family. And so we started looking for an RV. At that time, I had met one GARB evangelist who made his own trailer, and he traveled in his trailer. And I said, honey, that's what we need to pray about. And we even got to the place where I would call the pastor and say, Pastor, we would even be willing to stay in a room in the local church during the week of meetings, because we do need privacy as a family. And so we pioneered that, and later on, we pioneered the homeschooling thing. We were at Pensacola for meetings in the early 70s, and Mrs. Horton came to my wife and she said, Miss Comfort, what are you using for homeschooling? She said, well, Miss Horton, the only thing that's available is Calvert School out of Baltimore. She said, Miss Horton, you ought to pray about putting your material in correspondence. She said, I know a lot of missionaries and evangelists would respond to that. She called my wife in a month and she said, Miss Comfort, the Lord has directed me to put my curriculum in correspondence. She said, would your daughter Rhonda be the pilot for my curriculum? And so our daughter was the first one to use the Pensacola curriculum. So we pioneered that, and also pioneered children's meetings. I did not know any evangelists that had children's meetings, but my wife's mother said, honey, why don't you think about taking the children while your husband is preaching? And she did. When my wife was at Bob Jones Academy, she would go out on the weekends and have Bible clubs on extension with children. And God was using that to prepare her for children's meetings. You know, you talk about being dealt with properly as a child. We were in New Zealand, and the missionary came to me and said, I was saved under your wife's children's meetings. There's a pastor of a large church in New England that he and his brother, both who were in the ministry, were saved in my wife's children's meetings. So we had the privilege of pioneering several of these avenues in ministry that the men are using now.
I'd like to, maybe in another segment, I'd like to focus a little bit more on your wife and her part in the ministry. But in these early days, so here you are, you're ministering in West Virginia and Youth for Christ, and there you come in close proximity with your wife-to-be. And, and then she's, pretty much right out of high school, and you folks, launch out into ministry, which it's amazing to hear the time frame of that, and to think about, in our next session, we'll talk about leaving West Virginia, or at least leaving Youth for Christ and heading forward. But to finish up, I want to back up just a little bit, back up into your academy and college experience for a moment. You know, when I came to Ambassador in '92, you were 50 years old. You'd already been in evangelism for a number of years.
25.
And but what was a 10th through 12th grade Ron Comfort like when you were at Bob Jones Academy? It sounds to me like it really wasn't culture shock for you. I mean, you were on fire, you were growing, considering the little background that you had in the Bible. Was it an adjustment for you to be at the academy at all? Did it just, your zeal just carry you through that?
Well, when I was 12 years old, of course I didn't know the Lord, but I made a vow that from that day on, I would never ask my parents for a penny. And so I was shining shoes on the streets of Asheville as a young boy. I would sell newspapers. And then when I started singing professionally, of course, I got paid for singing. So God was using that to where, for all practical purposes, I left home at the age of 15. And I've been on my own ever since I was 15. And so God used that. Let me back up just a moment. When I was a sophomore in the academy, I went to the dentist. When I was growing up in Brooklyn, we never had money for me to go to a dentist. And so I was having terrible toothaches in the academy, and I went to a dentist in Greenville, and he said, "You have 4 abscess teeth." And he said, "And what really needs to be done is for us to pull all the teeth on your top plate." And he said, "And then to put a denture in, it's going to cost well over $200. Well, 200 doesn't sound like much today.
Back then.
But back then, room, board, and tuition for a year at Bob Jones was $750.
Oh, wow.
So you put that in perspective with $200. And so Dr. Stenholm heard about it. And he said, "I understand that you've got some dental problems and you don't have money to get it done here in Greenville." He said, "I know of a dental missionary training school in Kentucky." And he said, "If you can get there, you can stay for a week. You can be uncut, stay for a week, and they will pull your teeth and put an upper denture in for nothing." And so I hitchhiked. Here I was a sophomore in high school. I hitchhiked from Greenville to Kentucky. And I never will forget, on a Saturday, they pulled the last teeth out, and my gums were still bleeding. They chiseled the front of my bone of my upper plate, and they put the upper plate in. And I went out with my wife, with my mouth bleeding, and I stuck out my thumb to hitchhike back to BJ. So your question was about independence, you know, and how I got along. And I think that even though I had no idea I was going to be saved, at the age of 12, I became more or less independent on my own and left home at the age of 15.
Yeah, it's amazing how the Lord, it's obvious for all of us, in hindsight, how He prepares us long before we're even aware. But, you know, just to think of showing up at the academy, 10th grade, and going through there, the Lord multiplying to you mothers and fathers along the way, and then seeing you have the opportunity to minister during your time at Bob Jones. Were there any, obviously you mentioned Larry Brubaker, you mentioned Brother Koss. Would there be any other classmates or people that you went to school with in the academy or the college that, you know, your time in the college, where special friendships or people that really influenced you as a peer? Do any people come to your mind?
Well, yes, there were several. Bob Taylor, who pastored the Pensacola Campus Church, and then in Greenville, Tennessee, and then up to Indianapolis. Bob was one of my classmates. Jack Cordell, who later became chaplain at King's College in New York State, was a classmate. Dave Hocking, who pastored one of the largest Grace Brethren churches in America, was a classmate. John MacArthur, when we started, it's interesting that when you go in your freshman year and you get toward the end of it, then you start being nominated for offices in the sophomore year, and so John MacArthur and I were nominated to be chaplain of the sophomore class.
Oh, wow.
And I edged out John MacArthur.
Oh, wow, that's something that I did not know. So
yeah,
wow.
I edged him out, and it's interesting that John never came back for a sophomore year.
Right, I understood that he was only there for a year, I guess.
Yes.
So.
I don't think my beating him as chaplain made any difference about whether or not he came back.
Were there, during your time in the academy, did you guys go to chapel every day?
Oh, yes.
Okay, yeah. And so did you go to the same chapel that the college students went
to?
Oh,
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this then, and we'll wind down our interview for today. What preachers, obviously, and I do want to dedicate a time in the future to talk more about Bob Jones Sr. and his impact upon you. But what preachers came through that stood out in your mind that made an impression on? What were some of the names of people that you heard?
Well, of course, any evangelist, and there were some evangelists like Glenn Shunk and Bill Hall. I looked to guys like that, Dr. Monroe Parker.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there were preachers, William Wardair from New York, Dr. DeHaan.
Okay.
Yeah, he came. And of course, Oliver Green was from Greenville, so we had exposure to him quite a bit.
I'm sure you had a number of pastors that probably many of us wouldn't know today, just because there's so many places, so many people, and all the time that's passed. But I knew that you'd have evangelists there, and probably some keynote speakers. What professors or what teachers really impacted you in your time at the academy and the college?
Well, even as a high school boy, I looked more to leadership from college people or college professors. Mm-hmm. And there was Dr. Strobane, who took a personal interest in students. There was Fred Affman, who, it's interesting, Fred Affman got a big kick out of putting me on the hot seat on Monday. I would be gone all weekend, and so in Hebrew history he would say, now we're going to have the world evangelist Ron Comfort tell us what he read about the lesson for today. And I would stumble through and he would get a big kick out of it. But there was a Dr. Besanson that was on the faculty. He pastored a church in Georgia, and he would have me go to Georgia with the team and hold meetings, and had wonderful meetings.
In your time at Bob Jones, how many preacher boys would have been in a class?
Well, when I was a sophomore in high school, there were 1,200. When I was a senior in college, I was president of Preacher Boys, and there were 1,200. or 1,000.
Okay. It's interesting, I heard about the World War II, post-World War II era where, men were going into the ministry after coming out of the war, and there was quite a swell. And so here you are in high school. To imagine 1,200 preacher boys in one spot. You could take all of our Christian colleges today that are within a broad circle of what we would say we're like, and you couldn't come up with that many. I don't think, which obviously was sort of part of your burden in starting Ambassador years later. So, well, I appreciate you taking the time to share with us about your life right after salvation, the influence of your brother Billy. I've always heard you speak glowingly of him, but to hear it in this interview, both in your salvation, your call to ministry, your time at college. I didn't realize the overlap that was there and the impact that he had upon you, and then how the Lord brought you through high school and college there at Bob Jones Academy, Bob Jones University, and to your start in evangelism and starting in Youth for Christ, and bring us all the way up to your to marrying Mrs. Comfort. So thank you for taking the time to share that. And I want to, in our next interview, I want us to be able to cover, those early years of evangelism and try to draw out some lessons that perhaps you've learned and you've taught many of us as evangelists. So as we end this time together, and you did talk about your wife, I want to end this interview on a high note. Tell us the things that you admire the most about your wife, and of course, whether it's ministry, as a person. You've been married for how many years now?
Well, we're in our 60th year.
60th year, so you know her well, but as you just give us a summation of what your wife means to you and her strengths.
I would say, and I did not go over this, but there were two young ladies that I felt I might marry someday, and both of them, their parents did not want them to marry a preacher or an evangelist. And Joyce has never complained one time about our being on the road. In the years before I started Ambassador, very few times we were in the same place 2 weeks in a row. And I've never heard her one time complain about being on the road. My wife is a giver, and she puts me to shame. This is not humility at all, it's realism. She is a much better Christian than I am. And there were times when I was going to start Ambassador, and my friends turned against me, many of my friends, and I would be tempted to quit. And I had taught my girls when they were growing up that the word QUIT was not in our vocabulary. And there were times when I would go home from meetings when I was laying the groundwork, and Joyce would come in the RV and see me with the covers over my head, and I would be weeping. And she'd say, "What's wrong, honey?" And I'd say, "I can't do it, it's impossible." And she and my daughters would say, "Well, Daddy, you taught us we couldn't quit." And so you can't quit either. And I would say that there would not be an Ambassador Baptist College if it were not for my wife.
Well, I'm very grateful for not only her ministry here at the college, but as I've had the opportunity to serve and be in children's meetings with her and to observe her in close quarters. And I know that you wouldn't be able to do the work of an evangelist or start the college without her help. So I hope that the Lord will raise up many more with the zeal of a Ron Comfort and the godliness of a Joyce Comfort. And we hope that these interviews will inspire people to be open to God's leading in their lives. And I would love to hear one day that there would be young men or young ladies that have watched these interviews and would say, "You know what? I'm going to give my life to the Lord for whatever He wants, and that maybe the Lord would raise up more evangelists and evangelist wives to do the work of the ministry. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to the next time that we have together.
Thank you.